She was called Princess Alice, not by accident, not as flattery. The American press gave her that name because they had no other framework for what she was. A young woman so wealthy, so publicly visible, so apparently untouchable, that the ordinary vocabulary of womanhood simply failed her. She attended state dinners dripping in pearls. She was photographed in Paris gowns. A colour, Alice Blue, was literally named after her. Songs were written about her. Dolls were made in her image. And she hated almost every second of it. Because here is what the society pages never printed. Alice Lee Roosevelt, daughter of one of the most powerful men on earth, did not control a single dollar of her own inheritance until she was nearly middle-aged. She could not open a bank account without male permission. She could not refuse a marriage that was, in the language of the Gilded Age elite, arranged, not with rings and contracts, but with silence, pressure, and the very specific cruelty of a father who found her inconvenient. This is not a story about a spoiled heiress. This is a forensic examination of how the Gilded Age, that era of obscene American wealth, of Vanderbilts and Morgans and Roosevelts, used women as financial instruments. How the architecture of old money was built specifically to keep its women decorative, dependent, and silent. And how Alice Roosevelt, brilliant, defiant, psychologically complex, was trapped inside the most famous address in America. Today, we are going to deconstruct the gilded cage built around Alice Lee Roosevelt, piece by gilded piece. And by the end, I want you to ask yourself whether the cage has actually changed, or whether we've simply redecorated it. To understand Alice Roosevelt's imprisonment, you first have to understand what the Gilded Age sold as paradise. The term itself comes from Mark Twain, who meant it as an indictment, not a compliment. A gilded surface, gold on the outside, rot underneath. Between roughly 1870 and 1900, a small group of American families accumulated wealth so grotesque it has only been rivaled once in human history. And we are living through that rival moment right now. The Vanderbilts, the Astors, the Carnegies, the Roosevelts. These families did not simply have money. They were money. Their bloodlines were balance sheets. Their marriages were mergers. And their daughters were portfolio assets. Theodore Roosevelt, the man who would become the 26th President of the United States, was, by every public account, a titan, a trust buster, a conservationist, a rough rider, the man on the mountain. He was also, by the private account of his own daughter, a man capable of a particular, refined, aristocratic cruelty. And to understand that cruelty, we have to go back to a February night in 1884, Valentine's Day. Theodore Roosevelt's wife, Alice Hathaway Lee Roosevelt, young, beautiful, only 22 years old, dies of Bright's disease, an acute kidney failure, just 2 days after giving birth to their daughter. In the same house, on the same day, his mother dies of typhoid fever. Theodore Roosevelt loses his wife and his mother within 11 hours of each other. What happens next is documented. It is in the historical record. It has been written about by biographers for over a century, and it is, I would argue, one of the most consequential acts of emotional abandonment in American political history. Theodore Roosevelt draws a large black X in his diary on that date. He writes, simply, "The light has gone out of my life." And then he gives his infant daughter, this child who has just lost her mother, to his sister to raise. And he leaves. He goes to the Badlands of Dakota Territory. He ranches. He hunts. He writes books. He performs his grief as rugged individualism, because that is what the American myth demands of its men. He's gone for 2 years. His daughter, Alice, does not see him. What gets built in those 2 years, in that absence, is not just a family wound. It is the foundation of the Gilded Cage. When Theodore Roosevelt remarries to Edith Kermit Caro, a childhood friend, he makes a decision that reveals everything about the transactional nature of elite family structure. He asks Edith to raise Alice, but he makes another decision, quieter and more devastating. He almost never speaks Alice's mother's name again. Not to Alice, not publicly, not in his autobiography, which mentions the birth of his first child, but omits entirely the name of the woman who died giving birth to her. Alice Roosevelt later said that she was 19 years old before she heard her mother's full name spoken aloud by her father. 19. Historians have debated why Theodore Roosevelt did this. Grief, some say. Inability to cope. A Victorian masculine ideal of emotional suppression. But I want to offer a different reading. What Theodore Roosevelt created in erasing his first wife from the family narrative was a power structure. He controlled the story. He controlled Alice's story, including who her mother was, and therefore who Alice herself was allowed to be. This is not grief. This is architecture. The first brick in the Gilded Cage. Let us talk about money. Specifically, let us talk about who, in 1884, in 1890, in 1900, was legally allowed to have it. Because this is where the story of Alice Roosevelt stops being a family drama and becomes a systemic indictment. Coverture. From the French couverture, meaning to cover, to conceal. Under this legal doctrine, which had governed Anglo-American law for centuries, a woman upon marriage ceased to exist as a legal individual. She was covered by her husband's identity, his name, his credit, his decisions. She could not sue. She could not be sued independently. She could not, in most states, keep money she had earned or inherited without his explicit consent. Now, hold that legal framework in your mind, and then consider Alice Roosevelt's inheritance. Alice Hathaway Lee, Alice's mother, came from a wealthy Boston family, the Lees of Chestnut Hill. Old money, proper money, the kind that whispered rather than announced itself. When she died, she left behind an estate, an inheritance that, by rights of blood, belonged to her daughter. Alice Roosevelt did not control that inheritance as a child. Legally, she could not. She was a minor in the care of adults. But here is where it becomes something darker than mere legal convention. She did not receive meaningful financial autonomy as a young adult either. Her access to money, to her mother's money, was filtered, managed, decided upon by the family structure around her. A structure headed by a man who had, psychologically speaking, already erased her mother once. Her stepmother, Edith Roosevelt, is a figure of tremendous complexity in this story. Edith was brilliant, politically astute. She managed the Roosevelt household and, many historians argue, managed Theodore himself, his image, his temper, his ambitions, with extraordinary precision. But Edith Roosevelt also operated within and arguably enforced the financial dependency structures of her class. There is a pattern documented in Alice's own memoir, Crowded Hours, published in 1933. A pattern of Alice needing to ask for things, of financial decisions being made around her rather than by her, of being given, always given, never owning. This is what financial imprisonment looks like when it wears silk. It does not look like poverty. It does not look like deprivation. It looks like a woman at a state dinner in a Worth gown, with no bank account she controls. It looks like a woman whose husband, Nicholas Longworth, a congressman from Ohio, a charming, politically ambitious, chronically unfaithful man, she was steered toward in a marriage that served the Roosevelt political brand far more than it served Alice Roosevelt. The wedding of Alice Roosevelt and Nicholas Longworth was called, by contemporary newspapers, the wedding of the century. It was also, by Alice's own later account, a transaction she entered with eyes partially open and options structurally closed. Nicholas Longworth came from an old Cincinnati family, wealthy, but not White House wealthy. The marriage elevated him politically. It gave him proximity to presidential power during what would become one of the most consequential decades in American legislative history. What did it give Alice? A house she shared with a man who openly conducted affairs. A social role, congressional wife, that was, in the power structure of Washington, subordinate to the role she had just vacated. She went from being the president's daughter to being a congressman's wife. In the currency of Gilded Age status, this was a demotion disguised as a coronation. Princess Alice becomes Mrs. Longworth. Read that headline again. She doesn't become anything. She is erased into something. This is the linguistic fingerprint of coverture. This is how the Gilded Cage announces itself, not with locks and bars, but with a change of name printed in celebratory ink. Alice Roosevelt was not a passive victim. Let me be precise about this, because the most damaging thing we can do to a complex woman is flatten her into martyrdom. She was savage with her wit. She called Washington's social scene with a precision that would make a modern political satirist blush. Her famous line about President Coolidge, that he looked as if he had been weaned on a pickle, is still quoted a century later. She was politically engaged, intellectually formidable, and constitutionally unwilling to perform the docile femininity her era demanded. But here is the paradox at the core of Alice Roosevelt's life and the paradox at the core of every woman who has ever been brilliant inside a cage. Her defiance was legible only as eccentricity. When she broke social rules, it was reported as charming rebellion. Princess Alice smokes on the White House roof, rather than as a woman systematically denied agency, expressing the only autonomy available to her. When she was sharp-tongued, it was wit. When she refused to be managed, it was personality. The cage was so well constructed that her resistance to it was incorporated into her image, made palatable, made entertaining, rather than recognized as the structural critique it actually was. This is what sophisticated oppression does. It doesn't silence the rebel, it curates her. Let us zoom out, because what happened to Alice Roosevelt was not the exception of Gilded Age womanhood. It was the system working as designed. 1974, not 1884, not 1904, 1974. Within the lifetime of people watching this video, American women could not legally obtain a credit card without a man's permission. This is not ancient history. This is your grandmother's reality. In some cases, your mother's. The Married Women's Property Acts of the mid to late 1800s are often taught as a triumphant legal revolution. The moment American women gained financial rights. But read the fine print. These laws were passed, in many cases, not because of feminist advocacy, though that advocacy existed and was heroic, but because wealthy families wanted to protect their daughters' inheritances from sons-in-law's debts. The law changed to protect property. The woman attached to the property was incidental. This is the most clarifying fact in this entire story. The legal architecture of women's financial rights in America was not primarily built to liberate women. It was built to protect the intergenerational transfer of elite wealth. Alice Roosevelt was a casualty of this system twice over. First, as the daughter whose mother's wealth was managed by a father who had already psychologically erased her mother. And second, as a wife whose legal identity was absorbed into a husband whose primary value to her family was his political utility. She was protected as an asset. She was not protected as a person. And here is where I need you to sit with something uncomfortable, because we are living through the second Gilded Age. The metrics are not subtle. By 2024, the combined wealth of America's billionaire class had grown by over 88% since the start of the pandemic, while the median American worker saw their real wages remain effectively stagnant. We have the Vanderbilts again. We've just renamed them. And we have the Gilded Cages again. They are just updated. Consider the modern phenomenon of the trad wife, a term that has surged in algorithmic visibility across social platforms, depicting women who have chosen, or been nudged toward choosing, full domestic dependence within high-income marriages. I am not here to adjudicate individual choice. Choice, when it is genuinely free, is sacred. But I am here to ask, when the algorithm amplifies one vision of womanhood over all others, when financial dependence is aestheticized, monetized, packaged in linen aprons and sourdough starter and natural light photography, who is building the cage and who is selling the tickets to look at it? Alice Lee Roosevelt's cage was built from legal doctrine, family psychology, and the social architecture of the American ruling class. The cages being built today are constructed from behavioral algorithms, venture capital-backed media platforms, and the very specific economics of attention, where a woman performing perfect domestic contentment generates revenue for platforms that would not pay her rent. The silk is different. The lock is the same. Alice Roosevelt Longworth lived to be 96 years old. She outlived her husband, who died in 1931. She outlived her daughter, Paulina, who died of a medication overdose in 1957, a tragedy so precisely mirrored in Alice's own motherless childhood that the echo of it is almost unbearable to contemplate. She became, in her very old age, a Washington institution, a woman so long-lived and so sharp that presidents sought her counsel, that reporters came to her house in DuPont Circle like pilgrims, that she was finally, in the last decades of her life, allowed to be exactly who she had always been. And I think about what it costs a person, what it steals from the world, when 9 decades of that kind of mind are spent navigating a cage instead of operating freely within it. I think about Alice Hathaway Lee, who died at 22, whose name was erased from her daughter's life as an act of psychological control masquerading as private grief. I think about the legal documents she left behind, the inheritance she trusted would reach her daughter, passing through hands that had decided, long before any court was asked, who that wealth was really for. The Gilded Age is back. We can see it in the data. We can see it in the architecture of the cities being built for the ultra-wealthy and the cities being abandoned around them. We can see it in the legal battles over who controls reproductive decisions, financial decisions, domestic decisions. We can see it in the algorithms that know, with unsettling precision, which version of womanhood to sell you and which version to suppress. The question Alice Roosevelt forces us to ask is not, was she happy? She was, by accounts, sometimes happy. Brilliantly, fiercely, defiantly happy. The question is, at what cost? And the more important question, the one I want to leave sitting in your chest when this video ends, when a system is sophisticated enough to make its cage beautiful, to make the bars look like security, to make the lock look like love, to make the loss of autonomy look like an aesthetic choice, how do you even begin to dismantle it? Alice Roosevelt once said, "I have a simple philosophy. Fill what's empty, empty what's full, and scratch where it itches." For 96 years, she scratched at every bar of the cage they built around her, and called it personality. So I want to ask you something, and I genuinely want to know what you think. Was the financial and psychological imprisonment of women like Alice Roosevelt an individual failure, a story about specific men making cruel choices? Or was it the inevitable, logical output of a capitalist patriarchy that has never fundamentally changed its relationship to women's autonomy? And if it's the latter, what does that tell us about the systems we're living inside right now? Leave your answer in the comments. I read every single one. And if this kind of forensic, unapologetic historical deconstruction is what you come here for, you know what to do.